The following episode features a historic article from the Nebraska History magazine. This article may reflect the language and attitudes of its time, and while it offers valuable insight into the past, may contain expressions or viewpoints that are outdated or offensive by today's standards. Any outdated terms do not reflect the current views or perspectives of the Nebraska State Historical Society. Welcome to the Nebraska History Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Goforth. Each episode, we explore articles written and published in Nebraska History magazine. The Homestead Act promised free land, but the reality was a complex web of railroad bills, land grants, and legal hurdles. In this episode, we explore the laws and the grit that built the Cornhusker State through the 1972 Nebraska History magazine article, Homesteading in Nebraska, 1862 through 1872, written by William H. Beasley. The opening of Nebraska to settlement in 1854 initiated the vigorous search for political, social, and economic advancement that characterized America's frontier experience. In frenetic undertakings, alternately called enterprise and speculation, farmers and merchants, newspapermen and politicians did not rely on their own abilities alone, but sought the aid of the federal government. Territorial opinion particularly championed free homesteads from the national domain. Nebraska's governors directed that sentiment by calling repeatedly on the legislature to memorialize the Congress for a homestead bill. Governor Mike Izard proposed that settlers, after living in the territory for 2 years, receive land donations like those given in Oregon and Florida. A successor, Governor Alvin Saunders, in the best rhetoric of the 19th century foretold, quote, "With such a law, enabling the industrious with limited means to secure homes for their dependent families, a very few years only will roll around before the rich valleys of the Platte, the Loup, the Elkhorn, the Nemaha, the Niobrara, and other streams in the territory will be made to bloom as the rose," end quote. Political pressure reached a false climax when Congress passed, but President Buchanan vetoed, a Homestead Act in 1860. Settlers deserted their Democratic allegiance and were rewarded for supporting the Republican Party when President Abraham Lincoln, its first successful candidate, signed into law the Homestead Act of May 20th, 1862. Congress designed the Act of 1862 to provide free farms, quote, to actual settlers on the public domain, end quote, who would obtain a fee-simple title after improving their claim during 5 years of residence. The offer extended to all citizens of majority age, to heads of families, and to immigrants who had declared their intention to be naturalized. Passed during the Civil War, Congress excluded anyone who had taken up arms against the United States and made a special concession that any Union veteran of 2 weeks or more might obtain a claim without consideration of his age, his nationality, or his familial status. Qualified persons could claim as much as 160 acres of public land valued at $1.25 per acre, or 80 acres assessed at $2.50 an acre. The act freed the homestead from liability for debts contracted before the issue of the final title. The well-known commutation clause allowed an entryman to acquire final title by purchase after living on his claim for 6 months. The terms of the act provided only one opportunity. If a settler failed in his first attempt, legally, he was no longer eligible to homestead. During the first decade, 1862 to 1872, Congress modified the original legislation, increasing consideration of military men. In 1864, an amendatory act permitted men on active duty to file entries before their commanding officers, or allowed wives to act as proxies before local land officials. And then, in 1870, a provision enabled veterans who had served at least 90 days in the Union's cause to claim 160 acres of double minimum land. 2 years later, in the Soldiers and Sailors Act, the duration of a military hitch became deductible from the period of residency. Wounded and disabled Union survivors were excused entirely from residency requirements, although they had to live on the land 1 year as an act of good faith before receiving the title. Decisions by commissioners of the General Land Office also affected the operation of the Homestead Act. Because a settler legally received only one chance to homestead, it was necessary to rule under what circumstances an entryman gave up his claim. The commissioner declared an entry forfeited when the settler was absent from the land longer than 6 consecutive months during the required 5 years, and he found that sale of a homestead before receipt of the title prima facie evidence of abandonment. In all cases, the defunct claims reverted to the public domain. Of particular interest to settlers on the plains was a decision that entrymen could use trees on their land for improving their claims, but the timber was liable to seizure if they attempted to market it. Contrary to these restrictions, a settler could transfer a portion of his claim without penalty for the use of a church, cemetery, school, or railroad right-of-way. Another ruling restricted an alien's ability to prove up his homestead. Although immigrants who declared an intention to become citizens might enter land, the commissioner decided in 1867 and reiterated in 1868 that they could not receive a completed patent until they had been naturalized. The original Homestead Act, congressional amendments, and decisions by the commissioner of the General Land Office created a legal framework in which the settler could obtain his free acreage. The act specified that free farms would come from the public domain, but not all categories of federal land were open to homesteaders. In its primary description, the General Land Office designated land as unsurveyed and surveyed. Only preemptors could select farm sites in an unsurveyed region. After surveyors had marked townships and sectional lines and had forwarded their plat books for approval, first to the national office and then to the local land office, the administrators classified this district as unoffered surveyed land open to both preemptors and homesteaders. Claims by other procedures were excluded until a presidential decree placed a district in the offered category. For frontiersmen who intended to homestead, rapid surveys were essential. The Surveyor General of the Kansas-Nebraska District in 1854 began to mark a boundary between the territories as a baseline for future surveys, but it proved difficult. Surveying parties encountered numerous problems. The absence of trees, traditionally used to mark sectional corners, the unabridged Platte River, and harassment by hostile Indians. More constraining than environmental obstacles were political considerations. The Surveyor General and his staff were patronage appointees sensitive to partisan pressure and popular concerns. Technically limited only by orderly rectilinear progression of townships, the surveyors responded to political interests. Most surveys occurred in Kansas during the struggles in the 1850s for political control of that territory. After passage of the Railroad Act, national interest focused on completion of the transcontinental route, so surveying expeditions worked primarily in the Platte Valley to give the company access to its land and to allow the laying of the right-of-way. The concentration of surveying parties in one area would not have been so detrimental if the land office had not operated with such meager funds. But appropriations were always limited, and in 1865, Congress failed to provide any funds for the survey. Perhaps it was constant legislative parsimony that moved one Nebraska surveyor to seek greater efficiency from his crew by making them not merely surveyors, but foresters as well. Surveyor General Robert R. Livingston proposed in 1869, quote, "It should be feasible and entail no additional cost to the United States to introduce a clause in surveying contracts in the treeless portion of the district, whereby the contractor should be bound to cause his chainman to deposit 3 to 6 seeds of some hardy and rapidly growing tree, such as the blueberry, coffee bean, or honey locust, at every tally. No time would be lost, for when the hind chairman came up with his tally pins, they could be thrust into the yielding soil, a sufficient hole or holes made to plant the seeds in, and after planting, a slight blow from the heel of his boot would cover them." End quote. Nothing came of the proposal. Despite physical, political, and administrative obstructions, slowly the surveyors managed their duties. The Surveyor General estimated in 1870 that surveys in the eastern quadrant and along the railroad route in the Platte Valley had covered 3/8 of Nebraska territory. Plat books of surveyed districts went to the local land office, staffed by registrars and receivers, where settlers entered claims under all of the disposition laws. Congress established the first district office in Nebraska at Omaha City July 22, 1854, and the first plat books arrived June 1856. Making the administrators more accessible to settlers, 3 new units opened in 1857. The Nemaha District with its office at Brownville, the South Platte District with an office at Nebraska City, and Dakota District with an office at Dakota City. The offices remained unchanged until westward movement of settlers forced the relocation in 1868 of 3 farther west. The Brownville administration moved to Beatrice, Nebraska City to Lincoln, and Omaha to West Point, while the Dakota City office remained stationary. A 5th unit was opened April 20th, 1869 at Grand Island to accommodate settlers in the Platte Valley. Responding to memorials from the state legislature and pressure of increased land transactions, Congress created 2 land districts in 1872, one for the Republican Valley at Lowell and another for the Western region at North Platte. After the Lowell office was moved to Bloomington, the 7 offices remained unaltered until 1882. Before the passage of the Homestead Act, the lack of business in Nebraska made the land administration a sinecure of sorts. Registers and receivers dealt with preemptors, purchasers, and those with bounty scrip. But dilatory surveys and national attention on Kansas initially restricted settlement in Nebraska. On the eve of the Civil War, the prospect of a fratricidal struggle also limited emigration into the territory. The commissioner reported that both Kansas and Nebraska large tracts of surveyed land remained unclaimed. Local officials performed only minimal duties. The Homestead Act promised to increase business, so the administration developed a systematic procedure to handle the anticipated crush of entries. First, the prospective homesteader had to locate land that appeared suitable for farming and was open to homestead entries. In this crucial step, the land office offered only meager guidance. Local officials informed settlers of surveyed regions, but provided no additional information about topography or farming potential. A settler who had just arrived in the territory might enter a claim blindly, or he might turn to the unofficial land officer, the land agent. The agent exploited the opportunity created by the settler's unfamiliarity with the district and by the administration's silence. For assisting and selecting and purchasing land, even entering claims, the agent demanded a commission or a share of the transaction. Despite their mendacity, Professor Paul W. Gates insists that, quote, these Western land agents rank with the registers and receivers as among the most important people on the frontier, end quote. The value of their assistance varied by the extent of their actual knowledge of the area. Some explored the surrounding terrain, others examined only the plat books. Nevertheless, for the newly arrived settler, the agent was a useful aid. After finding a promising site, the settler made his entry at the land office. In the application, he stated the location of his claim, and in an affidavit, he swore to his eligibility under the provisions of the Homestead Act and testified that the application was for his, quote, exclusive use and benefit and made for the purpose of actual settlement and cultivation, and not either directly or indirectly for the benefit of any other person, end quote. If the land had not previously been entered and the forms were in order, the register accepted the claim, and the settler paid the necessary fees and commissions to the receiver. At this point, the settler possessed an interlocutory land entry, which meant he could reside on the land while complying with the remaining requirements of the Homestead Act. The homesteader returned to his land to cultivate and to improve it. After 5, but before 7 years of residency, the entryman, his widow, or their heirs could make a final entry. The claimant signed an affidavit that he was a citizen of the United States, had cultivated his land for at least 5 years, had not alienated any portion of the original entry, and had to remain loyal to the United States. 2 witnesses attested to the affidavit. Then he paid his final fees and received in return a certificate that entitled him to a patent if the General Land Office accepted his final entry. Before the title arrived, which might take years, the settler was placed in a rather anomalous position. The courts considered the settler the legal owner of the land, and the claim became subject to many legal processes, including sale. Yet the title remained vested in the United States government, and jurisdiction of the land remained with the General Land Office. Commutation provided another option for the homesteader. A settler who presented 2 witnesses that he had lived on and improved his claim during a 6-month period could purchase his entry at minimum price without waiting for the 5-year period to expire. The procedure used by the General Land Office relied entirely on sworn statements by claimants and witnesses to enforce compliance with the regulations of the Homestead Act. For the first decade of homestead operations in Nebraska, over 28,000 entries were made, which included over 3.3 million acres. Of the 28,000 entries, 16,188 made final claims. Although entries rose constantly in the 10 years considered, the end of the Civil War brought a dramatic increase of entrymen. The growing number of claims is the most obvious pattern in the statistics, but it is also quite apparent that only a little over half of the total entrymen made final entries. The number who successfully completed the requirements for title never reached half the number of original entries in any one year until after Nebraska became a state. The trend lends credence to those historical accounts that find tremendous restlessness among the first farmers of the frontier. These numbers do not include the commutations during the same period because they were reported without distinction with the record for land sales. The commissioner of the Land Office estimated in 1865 that 50% of the homestead entries would be commutated, but research in 3 counties in Nebraska revealed that only about 1/3 of all the homestead titles were acquired under this feature of the Act. Breaking the homestead figures into district components, the effect of survey location and the accessibility of a region become apparent. The remoteness of the Dakota district north of the Omaha Indian Reserve was mirrored in the lack of entries at that office. On the other hand, the greatest number of entries was made at those district offices south of the Platte River. The pattern of entries also reflected the survey of the Union Pacific route. The heavier settlement in the southeastern region and along the railroad line explained the westward movement of land offices and the creation of the Grand Island Office in 1868. The records of land disposition under all forms of alienation at the Omaha office demonstrate that more land was entered under the Homestead Act than was sold for cash, including commutations and agricultural scrip. Moreover, at the Omaha office, the acreage taken by all methods was never more than that claimed in homestead entries until 1872. Although these statistics illustrate that settlers did not receive an opportunity to locate a claim, the chart does not show how the amount of land claimed by the railroads nor the number of entrymen who failed to prove up their homesteads. Nevertheless, homesteading was the primary procedure for locating land in the first decade of its operation. The sale of land did continue, and large purchases were news in Nebraska, particularly if the buyer was an outsider. In June 1867, the Nebraska City News reported, quote, "A gentleman from New York, said to be worth $3 million, entered 11,000 acres of land," end quote. The gentleman may have been Ira Davenport of New York, who bought 17,000 acres in Nebraska from 1863 to 1873. In the first decade of homestead operation, 98 different persons purchased tracts of land at least 2,560 acres, 16 times the maximum size of a homestead claim from a public domain. At the Omaha office, of 136,450 acres purchased, 98,440 acres were sold in blocks of 2,560 acres or larger. Small wonder that governors encouraged legislative memorials to the United States Congress to end the public sale of land. Acting Governor Algernon Paddock, during a speech in 1867, requested the following modifications. Quote, "First, prohibiting any further issuing of warrants or land scrip for any purpose whatever, except for the usual endowments to new states or for internal improvements in the states and territories where the lands are located. Second, forbidding the location of any warrants or agricultural college scrip of a greater amount than 2 sections in each township. And third, withdrawing the government's land from public sale and reserving all, except those donated, as before mentioned, exclusively for location under the homestead and preemption laws, end quote. He went on to suggest that Congress purchase the land donated to the Burlington Railway, quote, provided that every acre thus regained by the government should be held exclusively for the location under a homestead law, which should require every settler to cultivate at least 20 acres of timber on his homestead, the preservation of which for 5 years should be one of the essential conditions of obtaining a fee simple of his land, end quote. The sale of land remained, however, a major feature of the disposition laws. Paddock's apprehension reflected the contemporary concern that actual settlers would be denied an opportunity to secure farms from the national lands. That attitude assigned an unwarranted primacy to the Homestead Act among the laws governing the alienation of government land. Once described as incongruous, the disposition laws formed a comprehensive giveaway system that rapidly transferred public land at little or no cost into the hands of private individuals. The Homestead Act supplemented the other methods of alienation by increasing the opportunity for persons to participate in the development of the frontier through personal labor rather than purchase. In this sense, the Act concluded a general trend to reduce both the cash payment and the minimum size of an entry that began shortly after the initial land provisions of the Ordinance of 1785. Although it was only one of the possible procedures for acquiring land, it was frequently used for initial entries in the early years. One study calculated that despite the number of early failures, 80% of the land available to homesteaders in Nebraska eventually passed to private title through the Homestead Act or other settler-oriented legislation. The opportunities for settlers under the homestead provisions must not be overdrawn. The homesteader's great advantage was the provision that allowed entries on unoffered land, but claims still had to be made in survey districts. The course of the survey in Nebraska opened land early in the Platte Valley, but in many sections it lay astride the railroad path and only 80 acres could be obtained. A more serious disability handicapped the homesteader because his claims could not be held liable for debts during the 5 years of residency. That clause severely restricted the claimant's access to mortgage funds, leaving only short-term chattel loans. The inability to obtain credit may account for much of the fraud under the Homestead Act. Generally, homesteaders who obeyed the law only partially participated in the frontier boom activities. Residency requirements curtailed mobility, denying them access to subsidiary income from temporary employment, and prohibitions restricted funds from the sale of land parcels or timber stands from their claim. Many of these provisions had been made with good intentions, but they cut cross-grain to exploitative enterprise of the frontier. Men did not come to the territories to become subsistence farmers, but to establish a home and to make a profit. Perhaps the Homestead Act can be compared to indentured servitude in the colonies. It was a useful system for the indentured servant, but less appealing than other procedures for making a start in the New World. During the first decade of operation, the limited size of entries, the restrictions on movement and profiteering, and the isolation from credit made the Homestead Act less appealing than other methods of acquiring title. It is possible that many of the settlers who failed to make final entry on their homestead claim were among those who purchased or used some other law to obtain farm sites. Promoters who boomed Nebraska with local pride and desire for personal profit realized the Homestead Act would not distinguish their territory from other frontier regions, but the passage of the Transcontinental Railroad Bill promised to make Nebraska the focus of new settlers. One editor, seeing both laws as the pillars upon which territorial prosperity would rest, reported with infectious delight to his readers, quote, "The effect of these two bills will be the start of a great tide of emigration for the West, and especially Nebraska. The immigration will certainly be very large, even before the war is over. If it was only for the homestead law alone, many of those coming west to secure its advantages might prefer some other locality to Nebraska on account of the scarcity of timber. But the Pacific Railroad will make land in Nebraska more desirable and more valuable than in any other territory," end quote. Certainly, the Homestead Act lured settlers to the Nebraska plains, but it was only one of the statutes that created a legal environment in which the federal government encouraged enterprise. Congress had authorized other legislation complementing, often complicating, federal assistance to territorial settlers. The legislators added the Homestead Act and the Railroad Bill to a system that included land sales, grants to the states, and military scrip. During the 1860s, they passed the Morrill Act for agricultural and mechanical colleges and another bill that allowed individuals and corporations to post the cost of public survey in order to claim land not offered to the public, then added an amendment that applied the deposit to the cost of entry. The success or failure of the Homestead Act must be evaluated within the context of the entire land alienation system. All of these disposition laws affected the growth of the frontier, yet for many settlers, the Homestead Act remained the promise of opportunity in the Nebraska Territory. Thank you for listening to the Nebraska History Podcast. To learn more about Nebraska History Magazine, to listen to more podcast episodes, or to support our podcast by becoming a member of the Nebraska State Historical Society, go to history.nebraska.gov/podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and get notified when we release a new episode every other week on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, I'm Chris Goforth.